When we teach the next generation about how to handle their finances, one of the most important lessons that we can teach them is the value of delayed gratification. That if they take some money that they could spend on fun stuff now and invest it, that they can reap a much larger reward later. An even larger reward than if they invest significantly more at a later date. But this isn't just sound financial planning, this is also a spiritual strategy. There are times when God asks us to make sacrifices now in this life so that we can receive greater dividends in the life to come. Today I want to look at an example of this as Jesus tells a dinner party of Pharisees. So I want to read from Luke chapter 14, starting in verse 1, because that sets the scene, and then skipping ahead to verse 7 and going to verse 14. So read with me Luke chapter 14, 1 and then 7 to 14. One Sabbath day, Jesus went to a meal in the house of a leading Pharisee. They were keeping a close eye on him. He noticed how the guests chose the best seats and told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, he said, don't go and sit in the best seat, in case some other guest more important is invited, and the person who invited you both comes and says to you, please move down for this man. And so you will go to the end of the line covered with embarrassment. Instead, when someone invites you, go and sit in the lowest place. Then when your host arrives, he will say to you, my dear fellow, come on higher up. Then all your fellow guests will show you respect. All who push themselves forward, you see, will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be honored. He then turned to the host. When you give a lunch or supper, he said, don't invite your friends or your family or your relatives or your rich neighbors. They might ask you back again, and you'll be repaid. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. God will bless you, because they have no way to repay you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, in that culture, hospitality had strict rules. If someone invited you to their house, you were honor-bound to reciprocate and invite them. And if you invited a person of higher stature than yourself and they accepted your invitation, then that would confer on you additional honor. So hospitality was a way of achieving greater honor in that society. But on the surface, Jesus seems to be saying a sort of paradoxical strategy for enhancing your honor by taking the lowest place and allowing a person to publicly acknowledge your worth of greater honor. But you see, Luke tells us that Jesus tells a parable. Now, maybe your translation uses the word parable, or maybe it doesn't. Some do, some don't. But in the original Greek, that is the word that it uses to describe what Jesus is saying. Because this is a parable, we are invited to see that there's a deeper spiritual meaning beyond just what the surface of the story is saying. And so, how are we to interpret what Jesus says? Well, I don't think Jesus is giving them advice about how to behave at every wedding banquet they go to, although you could apply that advice and it would be wise in that context. Rather, I think Jesus is trying to talk about a very specific wedding banquet, the marriage supper of the Lamb. A metaphor used to describe what happens when God returns at the end of history, resurrects the righteous, and God's people go to live with him. And this celebration of the consummation of this relationship. At this banquet, it is imagined that the world's secrets will be laid bare. And we will see that honor and shame are calculated very differently than perhaps the ways we might expect when suddenly all is seen properly. Now, there's an irony here in the text that's probably apparent to the astute reader. It certainly would have been apparent to Jesus' original audience. The Pharisees are the group of people who claim to honor God above all. And here they are sitting at a table with God present among them in flesh, in the case of Jesus. And presumably Jesus is keeping his own advice and sitting at the foot of the table, the least honorable place, waiting to be invited up. But rather than recognizing Jesus' worthiness, The people are instead leaving him at the foot of the table and asserting that they should be the ones to sit in the place of honor. If they had eyes to see who Jesus really was, of course, they would invite him to the head of the table. But we are often very bad at assessing the value, the honor that is due to another person. This isn't just a Pharisee problem. We see this in other places in the Bible. For example, when Samuel is told by God to find a replacement king for Saul, God tells him to go to the house of Jesse and anoint one of Jesse's sons as the replacement king. And then we read this story. When they, Jesse's family, arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab, who's David's oldest brother, and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed, literally Messiah. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way that you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So in this case, who the Lord's anointed, the Messiah, isn't apparent to natural human eyes, even the eyes of God's prophet. So when the Pharisees exalt themselves and leave Jesus at the foot of the table, they're showing this same sort of spiritual blindness. And we can imagine at the end, at that great feast of the Lamb, they're going to learn a very embarrassing lesson. That they had an opportunity to exalt God, but they chose instead to exalt themselves. Now, in the second part of this discourse, where Jesus addresses the host of the banquet, he's saying that when you invite your equals or your superiors to a banquet, all you can expect is reciprocity. That once that return invitation comes, there's really no further benefit to it. Now, such transactional hospitality has a place. We can spend resources on things that have immediate benefits. I can spend some money to go on a vacation, or spend some money to go to a museum or to a concert. But if I spend all of my money on the comforts that I enjoy here and now, I'm impoverishing myself in the future. And the same is true spiritually. If I spend myself laying up honor for myself here and at the expense of honor that I might receive in the age to come, then in the age to come I will live an impoverished life. And so Jesus challenges us to take the long view, to trust that we can forsake honor here and receive greater honor in the age to come. Now, the essence of faith is acting as if we can take God's promises to the bank, acting as if he is faithful, and that our actions flow from that conviction. By forsaking gratification now with an eye to an eternal reward, we are acting in faith towards God. But the Pharisees show no such inclination. They're still busy fighting over the very best spots at the table. Now, the Pharisees are the religious people in this story. And sometimes it's easy for us to look to them and say, oh, those Pharisees, they just don't get it. But because they are the religious people, and when you're listening to a sermon, presumably you maybe are more likely to be a religious person, we ought to ask ourselves instead, does that shoe fit on us as well? Is Jesus' critique of the Pharisees fair game for us as well? Do we ever try to impress people rather than God? Now, a generation or so ago, people were very concerned about how they dressed when they went to church, as if there was some sort of correlation between a person's godliness and how much starch they put in their shirt collar or how neatly they ironed their pants. Now, today, we might try to do similar things, just in different means. We might pray in ways that are meant to make us sound erudite, theologically minded. We might tell about our lives in ways that are really not meant to share our deep struggles, but are meant to project us as being the most spiritual people. Are we curating an image of ourselves for others' consumption? Or Do we accept Jesus' teaching? Do we need people to recognize us, or are we okay with just God's recognition? We're also poor at evaluating the spiritual honor due to other people, because we have a habit of looking at the wrong metrics when we do so. Even within the church, we tend to look at people's giftings, maybe their charisma, maybe their education, maybe their job, and we use those to decide who deserves honor and who does not deserve honor. But Paul, writing to the Philippians, tells them that we have to think differently about how we honor one another. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 6-9, he says, "This is how you should think amongst yourselves, with the mind that you have because you belong to the Messiah Jesus, who, though in God's form, did not regard his equality with God as something he ought to exploit. Instead, he emptied himself and received the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of humans. And then, having the human appearance, he humbled himself and became obedient even to death, yes, even the death of the cross. And so God has greatly exalted him. And to him, in his favor, has given the name which is over all names." When we claim that Jesus is Lord, what we're saying is that a Galilean peasant with no political connections who dies the scandalous death of a criminal is our yardstick for glory. If we truly believe that, how ought it to change the way that we live our lives? Jesus doesn't seem to care so much about what people think. He only cares about what the Father thinks. So he doesn't have to be all high and mighty. But it is precisely because he humbles himself that God exalts him. Are we willing to follow Jesus when he goes there? What if God asks me to do the kind of job that doesn't enhance my reputation with people? What if God asks me to live in the kind of place that doesn't project the image of success that I would like to project? What if God asks me to hang out with people whose company doesn't enhance my reputation, that potentially actually detracts from my reputation? Am I willing to follow the example of Jesus, or do I need to tend to my own reputation and image here and now instead? Implicit in this challenge is a promise that if I sacrifice now, God will reward that sacrifice in far greater ways in the age to come. And so I'm asking, do I have the faith to act as if God's promises are true? Or do I treat them like they are dubious in quality? We like to say that the kingdom of God is upside down. This upside-down kingdom requires a radical rethink of status in light of Jesus, our apparent nobody that we hold up as king. Jesus tells us that we ought to value people differently, but we are pretty ingrained in our ways of thinking, and old habits die hard. So as a community of God's people, together we need to unlearn these destructive and deceptive ways of viewing ourselves and each other, and to replace those with ways of thinking that are grounded in the truth that Jesus reveals to us. That it is a person who accepts the glorious humility of Jesus that is worthy of great honor. Faith, trust in God's faithfulness, that he honors those who obey, is the essential ingredient in this transformation of our thinking. And so we need to ask God to give us eyes to see the world the way that he sees it, and hearts that allow us to believe that his promises are true. May we be such people. May he transform us in such ways.